Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Issues of the Heart podcast. I'm your host, Brother Kobe.
And I'm Rogers. Today we're looking at a pretty exciting topic. It's something that's been in the news over the last week and a half, actually going back a couple of months. And if you technically go back, it would go beyond a couple of months back and to easily, we could trace it back a few years in the making. And that's over the issue and the conflict that's taking place in Ukraine right now. And I know that there are a lot of people out there who are saying, well, hey, this is a prophecy, it's a fulfillment of it. This is Gog and Magog, or these are the escalation that's taking place in the Middle East. This is the end of time. This is it. And we want to look at it to find out, certainly from the scripture, well, what is the Bible telling us about Gog and Magog? And as well, what is a conflict taking place there today, and how does it, will it impact us as well? Because there's a threat certainly of World War III, and people are concerned about that being a real reality. So we'll talk about that, how the impact is taking place to America, what it may mean for us individually, as well as collectively. And certainly, I think there'll be opportunity to be able to learn from there. So consider it for a moment. Let's go back then with history. And I think it's always important to set the foundation to look back in history, to be able to understand what's taking place. If you just jump midstream into something without having any understanding of what's going on, we are likely to come to the wrong conclusion. So we would do well then to go back and to see, how do we get here? We know where we are. That right now that there are bombs falling, that there are shots being fired, that there are soldiers that are battling one another in Ukraine and in Russia. But the question really is why? How did this escalate? How did it get to where we are? Well, you would go back a number of years. I would probably say you'd be best served by going back into the 1920s and looking at the beginning of the Soviet Empire, what would become the Soviet Empire when you look at the work of Stalin, Lenin, et cetera, and just to be able to pull those things together. So in the 20s, you had, of course, the founding in 22, the bringing together the Soviet Empire, known by most as the USSR. And I know that there are a lot of people who look at Daniel as well, and they say, well, hey, this is in the book of Daniel, et cetera. But again, history gives us the context to look at. So prior to this, in the 20s, or going prior to the 20s, you had these various independent states as such, or countries. And in the 20s, the ideology that would foster what would become communism as such began to take root, and these various nations came together. Russia being the strongest, the strongest one, or the Soviet. And the Soviet Union, because we as Americans don't necessarily distinguish and know the difference between them. Of course, Russia is the country. We talk about the Soviet Republic, et cetera. But when we talk about the Soviet Union, then we're talking about this a union of various states, or like 14 states or countries that came together under the Soviet Empire. And this was very instrumental, particularly when we talk about going from the 20s into the 40s and so forth, in the 60s. Now, of course, in the 40s, Russia and America, we were on the same side dealing with the war. Of course, after the war, then those things changed. In World War II, at the ending of it, things drastically changed. A line in the sand was drawn, and ideologies began to form and to foment through time. In short, Russia began to close off from the West, to close its borders as such, similar to what you saw in China later on. And it's closing its doors, it closes doors to the influence of the West, et cetera, and it began to establish itself as a player, as a world power. And by doing so, one of the main teachers of it was communism. And so a communist society is different from a capitalist society. And then in terms of a communist society, then things are relegated and run by the government. The government be able to tell you what your profession will be and so forth. And you're working together like a communal form of making sure that the needs of all are taken care of. There's certainly some good things in there, and certainly some evils that will exist, the same as what you have in socialism, or you may have in a capitalistic society and so forth. But in short, though, those things took place for decades, and the Cold War escalated. It was called the Cold War because it was a war of wars. There was no fighting one another, no bombs and so forth. And so you had America on the one side in the West, and you had Russia, or should probably say the Soviet Union, because again, we think of Russia just as a country, but you must think of it just in terms of the whole impact. This is a large area, mammoth area, covering thousands upon thousands of miles. covering like 11 or 12 different time zones, just, a huge area that is there with a lot of massive power. And so during the buildup on the Cold War, most of you probably are younger folks, and so you wouldn't have been around in the 60s. But in the 60s, of course, you had tensions that escalated between Russia and America, and it was really of a concern as this nuclear arms race took place. Who would there be a nuclear war? Who was going to be first to put a man on the moon? Who's going to be first in space? So you had all these different things taking place, between Russia and America, really positioning themselves to see, well, who's going to be the superpower that's going to lead the world? Will the world fall in line with communism, or will it fall in line with capitalism and so forth? Long story short, in the 60s, you had something that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And JFK was, of course, living during that time, and that became particularly of importance to America because Cuba is a communist country. Of course, you have Cuba, you have China, you have some other cities and countries and so forth in the South America, Venezuela, etc. But these are communist countries, and when Cuba allowed Russia to bring over warheads, then that was a concern, particularly if you are on the East Coast, because now you are just 90 miles. Cuba is an island, a nation, just 90 miles off of Florida. And so now this would give Russia complete immediate access to the East Coast. So this created an escalation. And if you were living during that time, students used to practice in school, what you would do in the nuclear fallout, getting underneath desks and so forth, trying to protect themselves if this was something that would happen. So there was a real threat of war, but again, no war happened. And so it was called the Cold War. You fast forward to, of course, the 80s, in the mid 80s, going into the 90s, and various players come to light. You look at the working of Ronald Reagan, as well as Margaret Thatcher, who was a prime minister, and then the work of Pope John Paul II of really trying to bring solidarity and to bring down the communism in Russia, or in the Soviet Union, I should say. And so this was effective means. The people in Poland began to push for freedom, for independence, and so forth. And there were always different pushes from people in various factions and groups, but they really just didn't gain the momentum to be able to bring about change. And so in Poland, this area began to push for change, and the rift was beginning to be seen, a divot in the Iron Curtain. America played its part in terms of escalating or ratcheting up the spending, and no country on the earth at that time had as deep pockets as America had. So we'll continue to buy in this arms race. And so maybe Russia added on 300 armaments, then we would add in 800 armaments. And so there was no way Russia could keep up with the manpower, with the resources, the wealth that America had, being a capitalistic nation, having access to various markets, financial markets, to be able to raise funds and so forth, whereas Russia was literally, or the Soviet Union was cut off from most of the world. So as this continued to go on and Russia continued to keep up, it was a situation where, if you put it in just simple layman's terms, it would be like your neighbor going out to the store buying something, and everything they bought, you wanted to go in to buy and duplicate. And that's totally fine if you have the resources for it. But if you don't have the money to be able to do it, and you're just determined, I'm going to keep up with everything they buy. One TV, well, I want to try to get me one TV. They got a new car, I want to get me a new car. They get a new, they're going on vacation, I'm going to go on vacation. And you can see very quickly how that could escalate and that could cause you financial ruin. And this is, in a nutshell, what happened in the Soviet Empire. They essentially continued to go bankrupt as they were not able to keep up with this huge outlay of means that was taking place in Washington and around the world. And so the Pope, of course, was instrumental in it, in helping to push for freedoms and the needs of people that were speaking of the church, etc. So when the Soviet Empire collapsed in circa 1991, 92, when the Iron Curtain came down, then these nations then would need to decide, what did they want to do? And so in effect, you had then the country of Russia being the main remnant of, as it were, the Soviet Empire, holding on to the ideology of communism and so forth. Many of these other countries, they wanted to give democracy a chance. And so in particular, we talk about Ukraine. Ukraine comes into the picture because it wanted it voted then to go into becoming a democratic society and so forth. And so we saw all these things taking place in the news. Problem is that in the mix of it, that Ukraine was one of the places that Russia stored a lot of nuclear weapons, etc. And again, just really cursory history, just at a 30,000 foot overview, because Ukraine had all these weapons there, and Russia basically like, hey, we want our weapons back. Because this is the vestige of the Soviet Empire. They made agreements to say, well, look, we'll give you your weapons if you give us our independence, let us be free, and so forth. So Ukraine agreed, Russia agreed to that. And of course, as time goes on, sometimes people renege on those deals and what they want. Ukraine also, incidentally, is where Chernobyl existed. So we talk, or is. So we talk about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster that was there in Ukraine. So it's a very interesting. It's a very profitable region for Russia, an area that in terms of like the country would certainly like to have. And then the other places, of course, are resources of what they're able to grow, producing foods and so forth to be able to sustain and to support people. So there's been a number of things that have taken place since the 90s and so forth. Some of them, most recently, Russia, of course, it runs its pipeline to be able to bring crude and oil and so forth that goes through Ukraine. Ukraine was accused of siphoning off of some of those things. And so, of course, you know, you're taking people's money, never going to be a good situation. So those things escalate. Ukraine is leaning towards the West. And into Europe, if you look at it on the map and see where it's situated, you see that it borders in going into Europe. And so Russia looks and says, well, hey, we don't want the expansion of Westernism or Western influence encroaching upon us, because again, that's a border part of Russia where Ukraine sits. So consequently, Ukraine has said, well, we want to be a part of NATO. And so much of what you see in the news is Ukraine saying, we want to be a part of NATO. And NATO has not allowed them in. Russia doesn't want them to be in. By allowing them to be in, then that means that from the Russian perspective, that the West is literally in our backyard. So we don't want them there. By the way, the way that the country is, of course, the people who are closer to Russia in terms of like on the western slope of Ukraine or the area, then these people more identify with Russia. You have the old ways. You just, you're right there. It's like the same as in the States, people who are on the border with Canada. There's some convergence of ideologies and so forth, back and forth between people who are in, say, Texas or who are in Florida. It wouldn't be really, really close interaction or relation. So just visualize it that way. Right on that border, there's going to be that give and play between both of these parties. So where does it put us today then? In effect, Putin has said, hey, I want this back. And there have been some people there who have said, well, we want to go back to Russia. Now, there's a question as to whether or not this is the majority of the people. In fact, many polls suggest that this is not the majority of people. Like 73% really want to be independent of Russia, but there are some who want to be there. So in 2014, the former or the previous president of Ukraine essentially was trying to align Ukraine back to Russia, and the people revolted and said, no, we're not down with this. We don't want that. And they caused the president to go into exile, and that did not look good for Russia. So in the last few days, as the discussions have ratcheted up and the Russian military has moved in and come closer, then it became an issue. Well, would Russia invade the Ukraine, or would Russia invade Ukraine? Now, because they're not a member of NATO, then that means that they don't have anyone to essentially come to their aid. The whole thing with alliances with NATO is that if you attack a country that's in NATO, then it's like having your big brother. Everybody's going to come at you. But because Russia blocked Ukraine from becoming a member, it simply is a country that needs resources and help. And so this is where then the plot thickens as such, because America doesn't want to get involved, because if we do, then there's a threat of world war.
I have a question. All right, I thought the Ukraine was already in NATO, so you're saying they are not in NATO?
No, they want to be a member of NATO.
Okay, so basically, the Ukraine doesn't have any alliances that can help them.
Yeah, they don't. So really now countries are sending in arms, which could create, which in theory could create an issue. America sent in arms, Switzerland has sent arms and so forth. Weapons to be able to help the Ukraine people to fight this fight, because they're saying, look, if we put U.S. troops on the ground, then in effect, now this becomes our war. This is a war of the US versus Russia. And now that could escalate and ratchet things up. Or if another country puts their soldiers there, then that's an issue. Now, there are different Americans, different citizens of various countries that are getting on planes going to fight, but it is not something that is being done by a foreign government, because to do so, then now you're involved in the fight. And again, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And so this is, Putin is looking, saying, hey, this is an ideology. I don't want a Western influence coming in. I want to stick to communism. His idea is to be able to reestablish the Soviet Union, to get it back to its former glory. We want to have these Baltic states and so forth. We would like them to be a part of the Soviet Empire again, like the Soviet Empire 2.0. Okay, and so Ukraine is a big part of that. So you talk about Crimea, which took place a couple of years ago when he annexed Crimea and went in, took it over. Now he's saying that, okay, I just want to go in and to demilitarize it, meaning, okay, they can still have their freedom. I just want to take out the military and so forth. But again, that's the suspect, because people are like, well, if you take out the military, what's to stop you from taking over the area as such? You're just saying, well, I want to just take out the military. But this is a conflict that is there, and America will not get involved in it because this would then mean now we're in direct conflict with Russia. We're in that your diplomats certainly don't want to do. Your president doesn't want to do that. Your congressional leaders and don't want to do it, and rightly so, because again, you get involved. Now this is America versus Russia, and other countries will be reluctant to be able to send troops, because that in essence is what they're doing. So that's the history, and that's really what brings us up to today. Where we sit, and maybe hopefully not too much history, try to skim it down, but that's really where we sit. And so, well, I probably should add, so as a result, most countries are saying, well, let's do sanctions, and there are different things. Sanctions and embargoes are different. An embargo means you restrict trade and so forth with that country. A sanction is just saying, okay, you're picking certain things to just kind of squeeze them to feel the pinch. And you'll notice that one thing that has not been done as of yet is that our country hasn't said, well, we're going to put a sanction on the oil, because we need oil. We are a nation that is dependent upon oil and gas and so forth. Now we have a lot. That's in America, but from various factions and groups, like, hey, we don't want you to dig, don't want you to get oil and so forth. And you have that whole thing to be able to work through, but we're very dependent upon Russia for its export of oil, and other countries as well are very dependent upon Russia for its export of oil. And so that creates a dilemma there. But ultimately, we said we're going to put sanctions on the government, and we're going to freeze assets and so forth. And so by doing so, the idea is to hit them in their pocket so that they will want to talk. And ultimately, what I would see happening from it, certainly not a world war taking place. You could have certainly instances of Cold War, of where Russia further withdraws and alienates itself and wants to posture. Certainly that could happen, but you won't have an escalation of war taking place in terms of a world war happening over this. It'll probably be a situation of diplomacy, where Russia would then need to sit down to talk to Ukraine, and there'll be intermediaries to discuss and to figure out, well, what's to be done. And so really to push Russia back into agreement. So they may just say, well, okay, you want us to stop fighting. What are the terms of us to get to the ceasefire and so forth? And so whether that may mean being willing to give up land, willing to give up resources and so forth, who's to say? I know Russia will say, well, we don't want you to be a part of NATO, but again, Ukraine definitely wants to be a part of NATO, and rightly so, because they look and say, well, hey, through this incident, you've demonstrated that we need to have protection of other nations. So now it's this small nation fighting against this large nation. And unfortunately, whenever you have conflict, people will die, people will lose their lives. And so you pray for the folks that are there, because this is not their choice, not their decision, even whether they're Russian or whether they are Ukrainian, you just don't want to see the loss of life. So you pray that, again, in time, that things will change. There are some pockets of resistance in Russia. And so it will depend, if you are having these economic restrictions take place and the people continue to clamor and they can make their voice and presence known, then this may be instrumental in favoring or pushing Putin to reconsider what he's doing and what he has done.
We want to remember the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia in prayer. We know that Satan delights in war. The prophet Isaiah said he saw garments rolled in blood. And the reason why Satan delights in wars is because he can bring many people down into Christless graves, unprepared to meet their Lord. And so we understand the crisis that these people are in, and outside of what we may see nation against nation, we need to understand the great controversy that's going on behind the scenes, the bigger picture. We're looking at the here and now, but we need to look more further into eternity. Satan doesn't have temporary plans. His plans are very far reaching, and so is God's. And so we're also thankful for the people that are fleeing, the refugees, that they're being allowed protection and safe haven by some of these other nations. So we're grateful for that. And so just looking at this, Jesus said there will be wars and rumors of wars, and I believe that's important in this sense because, uh, especially for the mind of the Christian, when we see these things, we tend to think, "Oh, this is the end of the world." The end of the world must be happening, or we tend to try to connect it with some great prophetical event. He said, no, these things are just going to happen. These are the beginning of sorrows. He's talking about the distress of the nations. And so these things are going to take place. We've seen the recently in American history, the world civil wars, World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, as you mentioned, the Cold War. We've had all of these wars taking place. And no need to look at all of these things as some sign of the end per se, or to try to make them bigger than what they need to be. Jesus simply said, you're going to have these things take place, but we don't have to stamp it with some type of prophetical significance. Maybe some of them, just looking back at history, played a part, but we're not going to look at everything and say, oh yeah, this is going to bring about the mark of the beast, or this is going to bring about the second coming, and so forth. And we're going to get into some of that. But what's interesting to me is when you look at the time of Christ, he came at a time of relative peace, so much so that Augustus Caesar set down the temple of the god of war because, you may have had little insurrections here and there, but for the most part, the nations were at peace. There was not these great wars that were taking place at the time of Christ. And so he came in and ushered in at the time of peace, yet and still we understand that, during the coming of Christ's second coming, we're not going to have that same type of peace. It's going to come through the warring of nations. But to understand this, that he said that these things were going to take place. And so, we shouldn't be surprised when we see it. For me, my question to you would be, it does, and this is a question that's being posed a lot, and people are going to, try to turn this into something, but do you see this turning into something? I even hear people say that America is going to join in this fight, and when America joins in the fight, then it's going to lead to X, Y, and Z. What do you see biblically, if anything, about this particular situation?
You said it first. Biblically, I don't say anything other than, and I don't say it like mildly, other than the fact that this is a reminder of the perversity of men. This is a reminder of the wickedness of the world and so forth, but nothing of a significance like, okay, well, this is the one event. I mean, it's just I saw on the news, a man, took the lives of his kids and took his own life, and in Zach. And so it's sad when you hear those things, when you see those things, and you read about those things. But one event, that event is as horrendous as it is, that's not like a fulfillment of prophecy. Yeah, it lets us know in the broader scope of prophecy of Jesus, the Bible says that in the last days, perilous times shall come. Men will be lovers of their own selves, and it begins to describe all the different immoral things that we would see. And so as we see those things, we're cognizant of that. We know that is in the end. So back to your question again, no, this is nothing of a prophetic sequel. Let's be clear, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, talks about Gog and Magog and the battle that they had. Now you have to keep in mind that would have played out had Israel stood faithful and true to Jehovah. We did a series and we talked about what transfers over to like the blessings and the things that were forfeited in literal Israel. Well, we only see Gog and Magog coming back to scripture in Revelation chapter 20. And I want to emphasize that when they come back there, it is after the millennium. It's like after the 1,000 years. So we even wanted to say Gog and Magog, that they are Gog and Magog, then okay, well, they're not gonna have any play until like way down the road. So it wouldn't even fit into like a sequence of events and so forth, because people try to make it on this is Gog and Magog. And it really all spirals into the idea that America's going to evolve, and people say it and they look with disdain and say, well, gas prices are high, America's going to get involved, and then the gas price is going to go to the roof, and it's going to cause the people to want to have to demand changes and so forth. And that's pure speculative thinking and so forth. Unfortunately, we've had gas prices that have been high before. You look back in the 70s and with inflation and all those things that took place, it pales in comparison to what's happening today. So what you'll have happen that will play out is you'll have the intervention of nations, peacekeepers trying to be able to come in and to broker peace. So nothing of a prophetic nature, nothing significant. It will pass away. It won't be, bringing in. This is not of the magnitude of the events that took place, say in a World War I, a World War II, the Vietnam War. Again, after those things, America said, hey, America's really drawn back into like an isolationist view in terms of our doctrine is dealing with nations, meaning most people we don't want America, we don't want to get involved in your conflicts. You figure it out. We got enough stuff to deal with on our own. And that was one of the lessons that was learned from Vietnam. Even with the things that happened there, it became a very divisive issue. And again, America fluctuates back and forth, but Afghanistan just ended that war, 20 years. And that was, again, not America joining in, but America leading out saying, hey, we're going to punish those that were responsible for the attacks of 9/11. But no, it's nothing that's prophetic, nothing that is significant, just, cause of concern. And yes, things could ratchet and to escalate. But again, frankly, will it escalate to something of a world war deal? No. They're going to do everything to mitigate and to stop. And so that again will increase with sanctions, embargoes, and so forth. That's the whole reason. If it's really just to get down and to fight, well, we got bases that are around the world that could be used. Then you start getting to a whole deal with NATO and so forth and agreements. It's looking at cases unprovoked and so forth. But nonetheless, this is it's a tough situation because again, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So it's not so essentially you're trying to convince an aggressive nation that is attacking them to stop without necessarily getting involved, unless Ukraine has other allies that they have allies that are outside the context of NATO.
One of the things, and I have to say this, because people, when they see nations warring, we have to understand when God created governments, one of the reason he created government was to police other nations. Not only that nations will police its own citizens, but what will happen if the nation itself, which controls the military, begins to oppress its own people. And what are the citizens to do? That's why other nations would have to step in to try to, put that down. And that's one of the reasons why God created nations, to have them to deal with, a people or a power that will become oppressive and that would do a lot of injustice. So somebody needs to police them, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we see there's different reasons why nations war, you have selfish reasons, you have righteous reasons. And I know some people look at, well, nations warring all the time is just bad. It just depends on the circumstance and the situation. Now, we'll say this, going back to the whole Gog and Magog, people need to understand, because every time they see kind of Russia in some type of conflict, they go to the whole Gog and Magog situation. We have to understand, though, when you look at Gog and Magog, there was not Gog fighting other nations and so forth that was in there. They were attacking Israel, right? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just Gog and Magog. It was a union of nations, basically, that came, because when you look at those names, Gog and Magog and some of the other ones, you basically had the sons of Japheth and the sons of Ham attacking the descendants of Shem. And so it was the nations attacking God's people. It wasn't Gog and Magog attacking some other nation. So when we see Russia just attacking another nation, how can we think that that's a fulfillment of that? And again, even when you look at Revelation's context, Gog and Magog is still a war against God. They're trying to fight God, which is a losing battle. And ultimately they are destroyed. Now in Revelation, it talks about Revelation chapter 11, talks about the anger of the nations. And so the nations are getting angry and they're marshaling their forces and gathering weapons, but it's not going to be them, this anger of the nations is not going to be them warring against one another. Again, this is them under the confederate of Satan fighting against God in the person of his people. So again, when we talk about prophetically something taking place, we will have to see the nations then turn on God's people, right? And so, if anything outside of that, just a nation fighting against a nation, and even, people were talking about the downfall of America when America jumps into war. Well, America is in the Bible, and God tells us what's going to happen with America. America's not going to fall because of some war that she gets into with another nation. That's not what prophecy teaches us. So if we start going down that road, then we're deviating from biblical principles. So we have to understand that. And so there's certain things, the foundation that has to be there so that we're not, every little thing that pops up, oh, could this be? Oh, could this be? Oh, could this be? We receive specific signs, specific things from the word of God, just so that we can know what is what. So we are not blown with every wind of doctrine.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's important. I think even more so as we look at this, and there will, as you have referenced, that there will unfortunately be other escalations and so forth. And if you just imagine, if you were in the, the 1900s, like World War I, like 1913, 14, well, 18, I think it started. That was like unseen, right? In World War II, unseen. You lived in the time then of the Vietnam War and so forth, like things that may have been unseen to you, but the history is there. So we're not saying don't be concerned in the sense to not to be prayerful, not to pray for those that are involved and such. But again, keeping within its proper context, keeping within its scope. This is not like the end of this is not the end of the world because of this conflict. And so it will pass away. This too will pass. But we need to pray and to be able to help people who may be misinformed so that they can be informed and know indeed what the sure word of God says. So I know that you done?
Yeah, that's what I'm about to say. I got nothing else to say.
All right. Okay. All right. Well, since we could talk more, but I think you get the gist of it. You understand. If you have questions, certainly reach out to us. Let us know. We'll certainly entertain it, come back and answer it, or either answer it or do another video if that needs to be done. But until next time, again, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life.